Hi folks, today I'm going to share with you some tips on how to introduce new players to tabletop RPGs. So it wasn't that long ago that I was a new player, and the way that I got introduced to tabletop RPGs or got to play my first session, I think was a really good way of doing it. And that was I got invited by the game master and the other players to sit in on a session, to have a character ready, and it was kind of like, okay, the first half hour, 45 minutes or so would be everybody else playing. I could watch and kind of observe, get a little sense of how it's played, and then my character would be introduced. And it was a very low commitment. It was just that one session. They even said hey, if you sit in on that first little bit and you're like, this isn't for me, we're not going to have our feelings hurt if you leave before actually playing. Now, granted, I sat in on that first 30 minutes and was like, oh my god, this is amazing. I can't wait for me to play. And I loved the session, and here we are. So that's one way of introducing somebody. Inviting them to sit in on a session and letting them observe for a little bit before then introducing their character and having them roll the dice. Now, I think that works really well if you just have one person and you're introducing them to a campaign or group that's already been together, so it's just introducing that one new individual. But if you've got more than one person who's new, or you don't have an ongoing campaign that it's easy to say hey, why don't you sit in until we get to a good point to introduce your character, then here are a few other tips. So to slightly contradict Ryan's video, you can go watch up here, I think mini campaigns are a really great way to introduce new players, especially a number of new players, to a system. And this can also be great for introducing existing tabletop RPG players to a new system. If they've only played D&D and you're introducing them to Shadowrun or Dungeon World or whatever system it is, having that mini campaign I think is nice because it gives you a shorter time commitment. So it's less of a okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to love this because I'm agreeing to a year-long campaign. It's, okay, we'll meet 4 times. That's definitely doable. And I think it also helps because that first session might be a bit awkward because you're trying to have to remember the rules so much, so it might not be as much fun because you're probably going to be looking up rules, and that's something also for Game Master to be aware pacing-wise. Give yourself plenty of buffer room if you have new players in a mini campaign. So doing that mini campaign, it's less pressure for the player to sign on and say, yes, I'm definitely going to do this long run thing. It's a lot easier to say, yep, okay, 4 sessions, that's totally doable. If I don't love it, I don't have to keep going after that, and if I do, then you can talk as a group of, do we take this mini campaign and extend it out, or especially if everybody really loves their characters and the way it works, or do you roll up new characters and jump into a new campaign in that system? A lot of this also goes for doing a one-shot. One-shot's a great way to introduce people to a tabletop RPG. It's super short time commitment because it's one 3-4 hour session, however long you want to make it. And again, it's very easy to take a one-shot and then branch it out or take those characters and plop them into another longer running campaign, especially if you enjoy running modules. But that's a great way, especially if you have a group of people that are we want to play a game, we aren't really sure what we want to play. You can do a couple of one-shots in different systems or different settings until you figure out what works for that group. And it's also a great way to then introduce all of those players to new systems to see what they enjoy. So whether you're plopping somebody into a new campaign or you're running a mini campaign or a one-shot, I think the next thing to consider is giving that player or players, are you going to give them pre-gen characters? Or are they going to roll up their own characters? Now, there are advantages and disadvantages to both. So with the pre-gen character, it's a lot faster to just jump in and play. You're not having to deal with all of the character creation, which in some systems can be fairly lengthy and a lot of math and numbers and reading through a whole bunch of different abilities and having to decide without really understanding the game. But it allows you to jump right in if you have somebody that just wants to try things out. I think pre-gens do work very well, but you might not have as much of an attachment to the character. On the other side, rolling up a character, it's going to take a lot more time. There's going to be a lot of rules. It might be a bit confusing, but the individual gets to really tailor that character to what they want to play. So I think that's something, as you're sitting down, figuring out, introducing those new players, get a sense from them of which one they would prefer. Now, what I did the first time I played was I rolled up a character. Not on my own. I think that's another very, very helpful thing to do with players is don't just give them the rule books and say, here, have at it. Ryan actually sat down with me one evening, a couple days before we were going to game, and said, okay, here's an overview of all of the races and all of the classes. We were playing Pathfinder. And then he asked me, like, what kind of character do you want to play? And I was like, a thief type character sounds fun. Rogue. And then, he asked me a couple of other questions, kind of explained a little bit of the, like, okay, here are the different choices you can make. 'Cause I think we were at third level. So, there were a little bit more choices than just at first level. And kind of explained it. And then there were some things that he just said, like, hey, do you have a preference for this or that? And I was like, I don't know. I don't really understand the difference. So he just picked one. And then we got into the game, and, with that situation, you might end up with, if you as the game master or more experienced player end up picking some things for that character, there might be a few things that they don't love once they get a couple sessions in, and maybe you, go back and you, I'm forgetting the term for it. Maybe editing me will remember the term, but you, go back and redo the character sheet and just kind of move forward from there. Or the player lives with it, especially if it's a shorter campaign, and knows for next time. And then I think the last thing when you have new players at the table is kind of a twofold. As the game master, let them make mistakes. Obviously, if it's like you're throwing a fireball into the group and clearly that player does not realize that it's an area effect and it's not just going to hit one person, maybe be like, hey, reread that spell before you choose to do that. I think that's very helpful because you're maybe not necessarily saying, no, don't do that, but you're asking them to rethink what they're going to do. But small mistakes, let the players make those mistakes. They're going to learn a lot more from it. And hey, people make mistakes in their real life, so your characters are probably going to make mistakes. And especially if they're small things that aren't going to have a huge impact, aren't going to end up with the total party kill, then yeah, let them make those mistakes, or find ways of saying, like, hey, you might want to reread that ability. I don't think that works exactly how you think it does. And then another thing that I found really helpful is to have more experienced players. If you have a group of, people who've been playing for 10 years and 5 years next to 2 or 3 people who this is their first time playing a tabletop RPG, try and lay out the table so that those new players are seated next to more experienced players. And then that's really helpful if you're running the game as the game master, and if you're not running the game, if you're one of the more experienced players, that's very helpful and nice for the game master, because then the experienced players essentially can team up with a new player to help them out. And I think for me, ask the new player, like, hey, do you want me to help explain stuff to you ahead of time, or do you want to try and figure it out on your own and ask me when you have questions? I think the ask when you have questions is the better method, but there might be some situations of like, we're moving into combat. How does combat work? Explain. So that way the game master can be focused on running the game. They can jump in and help answer questions when they can, but especially like in combat, if you have something of like, hey, what does a cone effect mean? the player next to you can be explaining that while the game master's kind of continuing, keeping things moving so that everything doesn't come to a dead halt every time there's a question. And I think that's also helpful for the new players, because they're more likely to ask those questions if it's not going to be like, oh shoot, if I ask a question, everything stops and we have to go look at the rule book and explain it. But if it's like, oh, I can ask this question and kind of be paying attention while things are going on, and things might slow down but not come to a dead halt. That takes a little bit of the pressure off of the new player to then feel free to ask those questions. Alright, so those are my suggestions of ways to introduce new players to tabletop RPGs, as well as a couple of tips and advice on how to make the process fun and smooth for everybody. Do you have any other tips, or do you have any cool stories of like how you first got to play a tabletop RPG? I'd love to hear that. It's always fun hearing what people's first experience was and how they got introduced. Let's talk about that more in the comments below. A big thanks to our patrons, especially Bryce. If you want to support our channel, you can head over to our Patreon page and check out the perks of being a patron. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to follow us on our social media, where you can keep up with all the videos that we do. Make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our videos. We make them at least once a week. And we also do stuff elsewhere, like running, being in games, and stuff like that. So yeah, our social media is just a great place to kind of keep an eye on what we're doing. All right, we'll see you next time on Roll for Initiative. Bye. Don't sneeze. Don't sneeze.